Hello, and you are listening to EcoJustice Radio, a project of SoCal 350 Climate Action. Our show presents environmental and climate stories from a social justice frame featuring voices not necessarily heard on mainstream media. EcoJustice Radio acknowledges that we record the show on the traditional territory of the Tongva and all of their relatives. Welcome, I'm Jessica Aldridge. On today's show, Right to Recreation, the history of African American leisure sites. I will be interviewing Alison Rose Jefferson, historian and author of the book, Living the California Dream, African American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era. Alison Rose Jefferson is a community-engaged independent historian and heritage conservation consultant. A third-generation Californian, her research interests focus on the United States history, the African American experience, historical memory, social justice, and cultural tourism. She is the author of the book Living the California Dream, African American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era. In her work, she aims to engage broad audiences through applied history projects and the struggle for social justice. From the late 1800s to the early decades of the 1900s, African Americans started to occupy and steward recreational sites and public spaces throughout the United States, and thus challenged racial hierarchies while expressing Black identity on the social landscape. In her book, Living the California Dream, our guest Alison Rose Jefferson examines how African American leisure sites were a catalyst for economic individualism, political perspectives, and self-confidence and a broader sense of community for Black society. In our discussion today, Alison demonstrates how Black communal practices and economic development around leisure confronted the politics of racial exclusion in recreational spaces. She shares with us some unique stories of these leisure sites, their rich history, and the influence they still have today. Thank you for tuning into EcoJustice Radio and our show, Right to Recreation, the history of African American leisure sites. I am your host, Jessica Aldridge, and it is my honor to welcome our guest, Alison Rose Jefferson, historian and author of the book, Living the California Dream, African American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era. Welcome to EcoJustice Radio. Welcome, Alison.
And thank you, Jessica, so much and your staff for inviting me to participate in your show.
Of course. This is such an interesting topic and one that I didn't know about at all until I saw your talk and saw information on your book. You are an author, historian and author, and you have the book Living the California Dream, African American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era. And we're going to get into the details later in this interview about what all that means. But I want to kick this off by briefly describing what is meant by a leisure site for African Americans.
Well, these sites that I talk about in my work existed during the Jim Crow era. And the Jim Crow era is the era when discrimination was rampant around the United States and segregation against African Americans, no matter where they were in the States. It just was different by the place that you were. It existed everywhere. And so African Americans set up places that they could control for their recreational activities. And sometimes these places were communities where they were able to develop housing, develop amusements, and buy property. And other times they were places that it was just one place they were able to get because of particular circumstances in an area. In California, for instance, in Santa Monica, there was a historic African American community that was able to commandeer this beach area that was the public beach, and it became known as the place where African Americans would feel comfortable hanging out.
And although your book focuses on California, these leisure sites, as you were saying, were happening all over the United States. And the listeners of EcoJustice Radio come to us from all over the country and the world. And they may be interested to know where you might find these leisure sites across the United States.
Yeah, that's right, Jessica. These places were all over the United States that African Americans frequented and developed. Some of your listeners in the Michigan area will be familiar with Idlewild. That was one of the big places that African Americans developed not far from Grand Rapids, Michigan. It was a lake area, and they had a couple of tracts of land that they developed for small cottage community, and still there. It's just not as popular as it used to be. In the 50s and the 60s, it was a big place for lots of music activity, with all the different popular music acts passing through there during the summer. Fox Lake in Ohio is another place, maybe not as well known to our national audience, but regionally up there in that Great Lakes area, I'm sure people would be familiar with it. There was also, say, for instance, in the Upper Eastern area, Sag Harbor in the New York area on the Atlantic coastline. And up in Boston, you had the Oaks Bluff area on the island of Martha's Vineyard. And then if you go down south to Florida, near Jacksonville, you had American Beach. You go down to Mississippi, you had an area in Biloxi, Mississippi. So these places were all over the country. In Southern California, they started a little later because the African American population really didn't get to be of substantial numbers here until around 1920. And even with that, those numbers were small in comparison to other parts of the country. But in Southern California, in California in general, and in the West in general, by 1920, Los Angeles had the largest African American population in the West, and it was one of two larger population centers in California where African Americans live, with the other being in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Yeah, and for our listeners, we're going to go into detail on some of those leisure sites that were located in California. But first, I want to talk about these points of interest that you bring up in your public speaking. And there's these three core aspects of what leisure sites brought to the African American community. And you call them economic individualism, self-confidence, and a broader sense of community, and then political perspectives. I would like to break each one of these down, what they actually mean in the bigger picture. But let's start with how did leisure sites support economic individualism?
Well, these places, in addition to being places of enjoyment, they were also places where African Americans were developing business opportunities to support leisure and recreation activities for African Americans, so that they wouldn't be harassed and that they would have places where they were welcomed. In California, although we had civil rights laws from the 1890s on the books that said public accommodations would be open to everyone in the state, no matter what race, color, creed they were, that didn't necessarily happen because the laws were not necessarily enforced, and white folks overlooked those laws when it was to their advantage at particular periods of time. And so with that, in developing these places, African American folks traveling could learn about these places that would welcome them, and they could go to them and they wouldn't have to think about the possibility of being embarrassed or humiliated by saying that they wouldn't let you stay at the place, or telling you that you had to go to the back door to get service and that you couldn't eat in the restaurant, and all these kinds of things that were humiliating.
And so economically, they were then building, right? They were building their own economic system, so their own businesses.
Yes. African Americans with these leisure businesses were building their own businesses. So, for instance, at Lake Elsinore, which was one of the older African American resort communities that was founded between around 1900 and 1910, and one of the furthest inland, the folks that began a resort there, had been there since 1885, the Burgess family. And they took some of their land and they started a small inn. And they held on to the inn through the 1920s. And people like Louis Armstrong would go to Lake Elsinore, and people like Alelia Walker, who was Madam C.J. Walker, the cosmetics and hair care Black millionaire. Her daughter, Alelia, would go to Lake Elsinore. She had a house in Los Angeles where she stayed when she was doing business on the West Coast, and she would go to Lake Elsinore sometimes. The Black doctors in Los Angeles would go there. And regular people would go there as well, who may have been teachers or who may have been working in some sort of service employment in the city of Los Angeles, but they made a good salary and they could afford to enjoy going to Lake Elsinore, some of them buying property there as well. And some of them, in addition to having their own place to stay, decided, oh, I see an opportunity. I'm going to also do what the Burgesses did, and I'm either going to develop my property and have a few more units, or I'm going to take some of the rooms in my house and rent them out during the summer. So as a guest house kind of thing. So the economic opportunities were great because of the fact that Los Angeles and California, one of the things that attracted people to come here, whether it be black, white, pink, or purple, was the fact that there was this beautiful climate that we had here, moderate climate. We had this sublime, beautiful landscape, and we had the opportunities for reinvention of ourselves as people.
We just spoke about the economic individualism as a result of these leisure spaces. And how did this also support African-American self-confidence and broader sense of community? You sort of alluded to that already, but maybe just speaking to that a little bit more as a part of these three core aspects.
Well, in terms of self-confidence, these leisure sites that African-Americans were developing were part of the national movement of the new Negro, and part of the Harlem Renaissance, which manifested itself all over the United States in different ways. These leisure sites were an opportunity for African Americans to see the fruits of their newfound economic success away from the institution of slavery, and in terms of not just business development around leisure and jobs around leisure, but jobs in the urban setting that were different from the things that they were doing enslaved in the South. And with that, they were more self-confident from the standpoint they were developing and seeing themselves other than laboring kinds of positions. And at the early part of the 20th century, this was a new era in general for people in employment. You were getting more leisure time available to you as an American citizen, as we had new labor-saving devices for manufacturing of goods, new labor devices for farming, new labor devices for road construction. So we had better roads that allow for people to move around more easily. So the technological innovations at the time were really helpful to everyone, and it provided African Americans and everyone else more free time. And African Americans took advantage of that, and they were demanding their rights as consumer citizens to enjoy the fruits of their labor and the resources of the United States.
And the last core aspect of this, we just talked about economic individualism and then self-confidence and a broader sense of community. What about political perspectives? How did it benefit that?
Well, there were a variety of political perspectives that African Americans were supporting at the early part of the 20th century. Some of them were more militant in that supporting of things like the Garvey movement. Others of them were more along the lines of self-help And in terms of that being the gospel, whereas the Garveys were more nationalistic, and they just framed self-help in a different way. I'm thinking about Booker T. Washington versus Marcus Garvey versus W.E.B. Du Bois. They were all looking at African Americans helping themselves to move forward, but they had different perspectives about how that should occur. And so with that, these political perspectives could be united from the standpoint that they were all about self-help and about advancing African American living conditions and political power within the country. And when you look at African Americans who were able to move out of the South and get the vote, and they're moving to places like California, that provides another level of political mobility, because with that, their concerns get recognized because politicians need to be elected. And so they need your vote. And so that happened all around the country. And with that happening on the local level, that also influences what goes on the state level and the national level.
Thank you, Alison. We're going to take a quick break. Everyone stay tuned. The next thing that we're going to do is talk about some of the examples that are in Alison Rose Jefferson's book, Living the California Dream, African American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era. We'll be right back. Hey listeners, quick break here. We hope that you're enjoying EcoJustice Radio. We air every Friday at 4 p.m. on KPFK Los Angeles and Sundays at 4 p.m. on KPFT Houston. Stay connected with us by subscribing to EcoJustice Radio on all major podcast apps and visit our website, ecojusticeradio.org, to check out previous shows and guests and get connected with us on social media. For an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon. Today you are listening to Right to Recreation, the history of African American leisure sites, with host Jessica Aldridge and guest Alison Rose Jefferson, historian and author of the book Living the California Dream, African American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era. Alison, we have been talking about African American leisure sites. And you have written this book, Living the California Dream, African American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era. And I'd like to start diving into some of the examples that are in that book. And for each of these examples, I'd like to know a little of the history and the significance of that location and the impact on the African American history. And let's start with one location that has been in the media a lot lately, and that would be Bruce's Beach. And that's located in Manhattan Beach. That's about 20 miles west from Los Angeles, California.
Yes, well, Bruce's Beach has been in the news a lot over the last couple of years, and it was one of the early African American beach retreats. And it was founded in 1912 by a couple named Willa and Charles Bruce, who started a resort service business there between 26th and 27th and the oceanfront. And this place became very successful during its existence into the 1920s. Unfortunately, the white folks down in Manhattan Beach protested from the day that the place opened in 1912. They protested the fact that African Americans had opened this resort service business, which eventually spawned a small residential cottage community of property owners nearby. They didn't want the Black folks to have this land down there. And after the Bruces built up their business with a lodge building and a couple of other structures to support African Americans coming out there from Los Angeles to enjoy themselves at the beach, by 1924, after being in business for more than 10 years, some white folks in Manhattan Beach got a bug and decided that there was a Negro invasion, which was something that was a kind of a catchphrase that was happening all over the country, where white folks felt Black people were getting too successful or having too much fun that they couldn't control. And so with that, they were able to get the local government to support taking the land where the Bruces and several of the cottage owners had their property, because they said they needed a park. Now, mind you, the area where these Black folks were, was the furthest away they could have been from the development of the city of Manhattan Beach, which was a couple of miles south. They were at the edge of what would have been the city limits. And some of the city fathers were involved in supporting this effort to push the Black people out of Manhattan Beach when they opened the resort, and in the 1920s, obviously. And the Black folks did fight to keep the place open, the Bruces and the other folks who had property there, but they weren't able to prevail. And they were bought out through eminent domain, and the land remained vacant with no park on it until the 1950s. And a lot of people tried to hide the fact that they had taken this land from the Black folks. And at this point in time, by taking this land in 1920s, with the hostility that came along with that, there were Ku Klux Klan threats. The Black folks had their tires slashed on their cars to discourage them from going to the beach. The municipality put up signs to keep Black folks from being able to change their clothes in the car. They put up signs to limit your ability to park, and we give you tickets, so an hour parking when there's no other property, no other place around there to park. There's no parking lot. There's only street parking.
Yeah, so utilizing a lot of ways to block access, to being able to use the space
and block access. Yes, exactly.
And what recently happened with Bruce's Beach? I want to make sure that we have time to get into the other ones as well, but maybe briefly, what recently happened?
With all of that, for many years, the site, it wasn't made a park until the 1950s. And then in 2007, lo and behold, we had an effort to change the name of that park. It had then, by that time, been called Parque Coolican, and it was changed to Bruce's Beach. And then fast forwarding to more contemporary times, in the last 2 years, an effort surfaced in a more militant way for the land of the Bruce's Resort to be given back to the family. It's something that had floated around for many years, but you had the racial reckoning happening in 2020, and you had a much more aware and motivated public officials with the County of Los Angeles and the state of California. And they just, in the last year, gave the land back to the Bruce family descendants. And then the LA County just did a buyback deal of that land that they gave back to them. So they got the land back. The county got the land back, but the family got the opportunity for some of that generational wealth that they lost passed down to them. It's a wonderful thing. It's the closest we've gotten to various kinds of ideas about reparations in our lifetimes, and we may get some other kind of reparations going on a national level.
Lake Elsinore, California, is another location that you discuss in your book and you brought up in the first half of the show. It's a little over 70 miles east of Los Angeles City in Riverside County. For people that may not know, it was this once flourishing lake in this desert climate, which was further inland from a beach or a large metropolitan area. And I was surprised to find out that Lake Elsinore had a significant African-American leisure community in history. Why was this community so incredibly important? And I know you spoke to it a little bit previously, but maybe expand upon that.
Well, in terms of the historic African-American community that formed at Lake Elsinore. In part, it formed because there had been an African-American family that was there with the founding of the town in the 1880s. And they saw an opportunity to engage other African-Americans in coming to what was an established resort community among whites with this portion that African-Americans had. It was a wonderful place in terms of that particular little valley. It's a beautiful little valley. It was hot. They had hot springs there. They were touting it for the hot springs and also for medicinal mud that you could rub all over your body. And it was a way to clear your head because it took you had to drive out there. It was like a 4-hour drive to get there on dirt roads. So at that time in the early part of the century, and with the tastes of this health tourism, it was a popular place. And this was a place where African Americans were able to buy land for vacation communities, whereas in the beach communities, they started being pushed out. For instance, in Manhattan Beach, where the Bruces had established a resort and a small community rose up around it. Black folks were pushed out of that area. But Lake Elsinore, they managed to maintain a toehold there in terms of property. And in part, it's because the resort as the century progressed, taste changed in terms of what was something that people wanted to do for their leisure opportunities. Some of that change was that Palm Springs became popular. And so people moved from Lake Elsinore to Palm Springs in terms of a desert climate. White folks, Black folks were out there too, but for the most part, they were they weren't developing resort spaces out there. They were working in the communities out there in Palm Springs. So with that, because they could have property there, and when there was water in the lake, it's a beautiful place, Lake Elsinore, and it's always been someplace that captured people's imagination, even during the Spanish colonial time.
Yeah. So in the 1880s, there weren't a lot of Black people in California, as you were saying. However, as you mentioned in the first part of the show, there was a community starting up in the Santa Monica, Venice area, as it's known now. Can you describe what was happening and the significance briefly? And just to put it in perspective for our listeners, Santa Monica and Venice area beaches have now become some of the most popular beach areas on the West Coast, if not the United States.
Yeah, that's right, Jessica. So Santa Monica was a town that was formed in the 1880s, and there were a few African Americans that were there with the founding of the town, and others that were buying land there in speculation because they looked at this area as someplace that might become really popular. The Venice area really didn't start to develop until the early part of the 20th century. It was marshland until Abbot Kinney decided that he was going to develop his Venice of America. And that's when African Americans started moving there. In terms of the resort kinds of activities that did develop for African Americans in Santa Monica, those really didn't develop there until after the turn of the 20th century. When you get a more substantial population that is there, you have the forming of the Phillips Chapel Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, the first African American spiritual and institutional space in Santa Monica, which is still there today, 4 blocks from the beach near Bay and 4th and Bay Street. And you had around 1914 an African American small resort forming not far from the church. And then there were other attempts at resort businesses by 1920s that were foiled, but African Americans were able to maintain a public beach space, even with the sabotage of some of their beach service resort development businesses, which they continued to try to build even up into the 1950s. But the public beach area in front of the Crescent Bay Park remained a place that African Americans would go because it was convenient to get there. You had this historic community in Santa Monica, so they could go to the church if they couldn't go to the restaurants or the bathrooms that were not public along the beach. And you had some of their friends that were in that area. So they could take the public transportation to get there and what have you. Because people forget that in terms of the early part of the century, we didn't have the road system that we have today. It was dirt roads, and most people didn't have cars. So even getting to Bruce's Beach, which was much further south, would have been challenging for most people, and they would have been taking public transportation to get there. And so in terms of Santa Monica, developing simultaneously in terms of the resort business to Bruce's Beach, for African Americans, once Bruce's Beach closed, Santa Monica was easier to get to. And so it has a more sustained memory in terms of contemporary times of people enjoying themselves there at visiting their friends in Santa Monica. And there's a few people that remember some of the businesses that did survive for a few years at a time.
You had mentioned access to beaches. During Jim Crow, access to beaches for people of color in California differed greatly from what access looked like in the rest of the country. And I don't know if people know that. And I thought maybe you could expand upon that briefly.
Well, in terms of beaches in California, the beach was open to everybody in California. But because civil rights laws were not enforced in certain places, and then you had the issue of what some people considered public and private land based on the mean tide line, which we still have today, it can be, problematic sometimes for African Americans and other people to go to the beach where somebody may not have wanted them to be. And as it relates to Black folks in Manhattan Beach, there were lands that some people would say were private because the white folks owned the land all the way up to the water. Well, some days the water was way out, and some days the water was closer to the shoreline. So with that, you could get into some trouble sometimes with folks about what they consider to be public and private property. And we've seen that still in terms of contemporary times. With folks being chased out of Malibu and Zuma Beach and those weren't Black folks, those were white folks, because some rich white folks didn't want them sitting out on the beach in front of their property. So once all of that activity was cleared up in terms of the beaches being bought up so that they were public, it became easier for African Americans to hang out on the beach, particularly in front of land that was considered publicly owned. Yeah. And with that, Santa Monica had that particular opportunity at this publicly owned park, and they could hang out in front of the park, and which park too, but
which differed from what we were seeing in the rest of the country, which was white only beaches, Black only beaches. I wanted, before we get to the break, ask, the historical legacy of the African American leisure sites has seemingly been erased from education that we get in school, and there's limited public memory of this heritage. With that also goes the awareness of the African American community contributions to the development of those spaces. We're talking about the economics, right? So do you agree that this is the case in our education system, and why do you think that to be so?
Yes, well, in terms of our education system, we don't do a very good job of talking about local history anywhere in the country. And so we don't understand how our local stories beyond the big national narrative sometimes have been very instrumental in contributing to the development of a particular place. And so that's why we don't really have that knowledge of these leisure places and other knowledge about some of the achievements of Black folks and Hispanic people and Asian people and and Jewish people and what have you in California. But that's changing because the California state legislature and the California Education Department have passed legislation and curriculum guidelines to make all the schools in California now teach about communities of color and LGBT people and other minoritized groups as part of the curriculum, that you have to have some sort of education in this area before you graduate from high school.
That's so lovely. And this storytelling, right? The storytelling is so very powerful. You're a storyteller. And the history of the leisure sites are amazingly rich stories. Before we go to the break, what's the importance and benefit of making sure these narratives are shared and heard widely in today's environment?
You know, storytelling is very important because of the fact that we are trying to get these stories into the public memory. And so in order to do that, you've got to document the stories and you have to share them in different ways. So it's important to understanding that the American identity includes many different stories other than stories about white civic leaders and soldiers. And that even though some of these stories might not be what some white folks want to hear about because of some of the crazy things that they've done in terms of discrimination, it's still part of who we are as Americans. It makes up the American story. And by including this broader array of the American story in the national narrative, we're creating a more empathetic society because people understand that it's not everything that white folks have done in this continent is on this continent, on this piece of land that we call the United States, has not always been very nice. And capitalism is not always something that's marching forward and that is always beneficial to every member of society. There are things that happen that have been detrimental to people like the Native Americans who were here before the white Europeans got here.
Exactly.
And also in terms of the contribution that African Americans have made, a lot of people want to brush enslavement of African Americans under the rug, but African Americans as enslaved people, we helped to build this country. If there hadn't been enslaved labor, you and me and many other people might not have some of the conveniences that we have today. And as it relates to these leisure communities, these stories tell how there was a broader array of people who were contributing to building various communities around the state of California.
And America's history, and the United States history.
Yes.
Well, we're going to go to break real quick. Listeners, stay with us. We're going to talk about what does restitution look like and some of the other projects that Alison is working on, and also where you can get more information. So stay tuned and we'll be right back. Hey listeners, quick break here. We hope that you're enjoying EcoJustice Radio. We air every Friday at 4 p.m. on KPFK Los Angeles and Sundays at 4 p.m. on KPFT Houston. Stay connected with us by subscribing to EcoJustice Radio on all major podcast apps and visit our website, ecojusticeradio.org, to check out previous shows and guests and get connected with us on social media. For an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon. Today you are listening to Right to Recreation, the history of African American leisure sites, with host Jessica Aldridge and guest Alison Rose Jefferson, historian and author of the book Living the California Dream, African American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era. Alison, we've been talking about African American leisure sites in your book and what this all means for the lands and or opportunities that were taken away from African American communities and other communities of color, not just African Americans. What does restitution look like? Does it mean giving back of lands, or are there other ways restitution can take place? And let's start this conversation first, though, with how you define restitution, and then we'll get into what that looks like.
So, Jessica, it's a big question.
It is.
Restitution means different things in different situations. So we have a restitution effort that happened here in Southern California with Bruce's Beach. That was a very individual family restitution effort from the standpoint of the monetary result of that to this family in terms of being able to gather up some of the generational wealth they might have lost had the family been able to keep the property and the business going a little longer. But at the same time, it also, that limited financial gain for the family also provided African Americans hope to thinking about how other situations in terms of social justice and restitution might happen to them. It was certainly a psychological benefit to understand that the government of California and the government of Los Angeles County was involved in this restitution effort. So it made people feel good, and maybe that will give folks more self-confidence to go after some other things that they want in terms of social justice. Restitution and reparations for everyone have to come from the federal government. And so at this time, we're closer to something like that maybe happening than we have ever been in terms of the history of the idea being promoted that reparations would happen or should happen. And we've had a few situations around the country with Evanston, Illinois, giving some restitution to people that lost their homes when urban redevelopment happened in the 50s and 60s. Asheville, North Carolina has done a similar effort as well. And many places around the nation, including California, are studying what reparations might look like in their region. And so I don't know what it could look like in terms of additional monetary situations for everyone in the nation. We're going to have these individual situations that I think have happened continue. But there's other things in terms of reparations that could happen, restitution that could happen that are more not necessarily economically valuable in terms of a direct monetary compensation, but they could be useful from the standpoint of making people's lives better. You could argue that on some level, education, better education system and better healthcare system are a way of providing reparations to people. And that's not just Black people, that's everybody. And then there are projects like what I worked on in Santa Monica to recognize and reinsert the African American experience into the landscape and to the civic memory of the city of Santa Monica, the region, and the nation with the Belmar History Plus Art project. We did a project where we did 17 panels in a park that talked about the history of the people, places, and events of the pre-1960 community there. And we did lesson plans, and there's a big monumental sculpture that was developed, and there were community engagement programs. All of those things are commemorative justice kinds of activities that provide people with the understanding that our community as Black people was here, and also that this community was right here by the beach, and that there were opportunities and some sabotage that allowed and disallowed African American experiences there in that community. And so from the standpoint of the coastal access, some people are like, what? You mean Black people lived a few blocks from the beach? And maybe that will inspire them in terms of their own experience, and that there's still an African-American community in Santa Monica. Maybe that will inspire a new generation of people to go after some of the self-fulfillment goals that they want for themselves, or try some new experience, or open a business.
And some of the influences that you're making, you are working and You're also working with organizations to promote this. You had just mentioned one, and I know we're going to talk about that a little bit more on the extended version. All of our listeners, make sure you always check out the extended versions. But one of them being the Culture Club South Bay, to bring youth to beaches, introduce them to the stories and the history of the area, and also provide multi-ethnic educational opportunities. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, well, I love, Jessica, these youth programs where I am working with other people to bring kids out to the beach to have experiences that they might not have on a regular basis, to learn about the history of the beach in Manhattan Beach at Bruce's Beach with Culture Club South Bay. I've also done things in Santa Monica with the Santa Monica Conservancy and the Black Surfers Collective and Heal the Bay. And so with the Bruce's Beach group that I'm working with, Culture Club South Bay, I'm really excited about that particular opportunity right now because of the fact that that's the only program that is bringing a multi-ethnic group of kids to the Bruce's Beach to have experiences with learning about the history of the site. They get an introductory surfing lesson for 4 weeks, so they actually can learn how to really stand up. And they get beach volleyball experience, and they get a multi-dimensional culinary experience. We're not just giving them hamburgers. They're getting to learn about different kinds of food, and they're meeting other kids and their parents who are interested in them having this broader array of experiences and meeting kids of all different ethnic and socioeconomic backgrounds. And so I'm particularly excited about that. And Alison Hales, another Alison, is the woman who began that program.
How did the creation of African American leisure sites influence leisure lifestyle across a new middle class culture?
Well, they were part of these African American leisure sites were part of what was going on in terms of the development of California as part of the leisure frontier. People were moving to California to enjoy the outdoors in this mild climate and find new life opportunities. And as part of that, in terms of this whole leisure, this whole outdoor lifestyle that people were looking at in terms of California, Black folks were coming for all of this opportunity as well. And so they were participating in sharing this new kind of aesthetic as it relates to living in the outdoors, in your backyard, going to the beach, going to the mountains. And all of this is happening in different ways than it was in the urban East. People were really thinking about the benefits of what having a yard and having a pool from the standpoint of a community, or having a beach from the standpoint of community access, could mean in terms of development and a particular lifestyle that could be for a broader array of people, not just the folks that were rich and had the means to isolate themselves from. It was democratizing what leisure and outdoor life could be like beyond the work experience. And so African Americans weren't necessarily the ones that started it, but they were participating in it, and they were leaders from the standpoint that they seized the opportunity of their cultural entitlement here in California in different ways than other minoritized groups did.
Do you still see that playing out in today's society within the African American community?
Yes, I think that, Jessica, in terms of the Black surfers, they are the ones that have captured that spirit in terms of looking at, and the some of the Black hikers have captured that experience in terms of thinking about how the outdoor experience is something that they enjoy and how they can monetize it whether they're monetizing it from the standpoint of developing businesses to teach people or monetizing it in other ways because they're a great surfer and a model, or they're a great surfer and they're able to enter competitions to compete and what have you. So yes, and the freedom that in terms of surfing that people espouse to that particular culture and the sense of fulfillment and play and the body practice and the beauty, because there's a beauty feature that's attached to it too because of the physicality and what have you. So I think that the Black surfers and in particular, but the hikers too, because there's a couple of Black hiking organizations as well.
That's great. We have 3 more questions before we end the radio version of today's show. But as our listeners know, there is always an extended version. So make sure that you go to our website to check that out. One of the last questions here. How did leisure sites challenge the anti-Black racist structures?
The leisure sites challenged the anti-Black racist structures because they were a contestation to the white folks belittling and trying to humiliate Black folks. Because Black folks were taking control of their pleasure and their recreation at these places, and the white folks couldn't do anything about it unless they did some extra legal means of sabotage in California to get rid of these places. And the white folks couldn't control the economic development of African Americans in these communities if the patrons were mostly African Americans. Eventually, unfortunately, these places that African Americans developed, aside from the sabotage that happened to a few of them, they did fade away because once there were more opportunities and places where the African American population can go, once the civil rights laws were fully exercised and our legal and judicial system, policing system was porting the laws, these places faded because white people wouldn't support them. Black people then started supporting a larger array of places, even if they were still going to some of the Black places, and they just couldn't survive.
Yeah.
For the most part.
People are interested in African American leisure sites, their historical significance, and how that might play out in their own community. What resources would you recommend to them?
Well, of course, Jessica, I would suggest that they read my book, Living the California Dream, African American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era. But I would also say that there are other books, not so much about the places in California, but places around the country that they might take a look at if, in their particular communities. There's books about American Beach in Florida. There's books about the Black resort that was in, or articles about the Black resort that was in, books and articles about the Black resort that was at Idlewild in Michigan. There's articles about the one that was in Biloxi. There's articles about Fox Lake in Ohio. There's a book or two about the Black resort area at Martha's Vineyard Island off the coast of Massachusetts. There's articles about Sag Harbor in New York. North Carolina has a couple of African American leisure sites that were on rivers and the ocean, and there's books about those. Hilton Head, there used to be an African American resort there in South Carolina. There's things that have been written about that. So there's information that can be found about these places. The National Park Service is getting ready to release a study about African American leisure sites around the country that will include a database that lists various sites and photographs. So that's going to happen.
That's amazing.
Yes, that's going to happen sometime in the next year. They're finalizing that report now.
Wow. Well, the last question, until we go to our extended version where everyone that's listening is going to want to go to ecojusticeradio.org to make sure they hear our extended version. Where can people follow your efforts, and where can they buy your book, Living the California Dream, African American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era?
Well, Jessica, my book is available at all your favorite booksellers in a hardback copy or a paperback copy. If you want a signed copy of my book, you can buy it from me at my website, AlisonRoseJefferson.com. And you can also learn more about the various activities and projects that I'm involved with at my website, AlisonRoseJefferson.com.
And are you on social media?
And you can learn about what I'm doing sometimes in social media. I'm not as good probably as you putting stuff up on Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn, but I do post at those places at times as well.
And we will make sure on EcoJustice Radio social media to link your profiles to our posts as well. So those listening, you can always go to EcoJustice Radio on your social media preferred platform, and you'll be connected to Alison. And reminder to our audience, we're going to continue this conversation. So visit our website, ecojusticeradio.org, to hear the extended version. Alison, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been incredibly enlightening.
Jessica, thank you so much for your interest in the work and in learning and sharing with your audience the information about these local stories in California.
Of course. And we'll continue the conversation. Everyone come over and join us. Thank you to our guest, Alison Rose Jefferson, and thank you to our listeners for joining us. This has been Right to Recreation, the history of African American leisure sites. For an extended version of this interview, become a member of our Patreon and visit our website, ecojusticeradio.org. Please connect with us on social media. You can find us at EcoJustice Radio, SoCal 350, and Adventures in Waste. And if you like what you heard and you want others to be informed, then you know what to do. Subscribe, share the episodes, and help us continue our efforts by joining our Patreon or making a tax-deductible donation to the show. A project of SoCal 350, the show can be found on KPFK, KPFT, all major podcast apps, and at ecojusticeradio.org. Executive producer Jack Ike, producer and co-host Jessica Aldridge, co-host Carrie Kim, and engineer and original music by Blake Quake Beats. And until next time, remember, the power is yours.